My husband left me for his ex after she convinced him I cheated. 8 years later, he wants to meet his son.
My ex-husband has to be the most entitled man I've ever known. Leaving him was hands down one of the best choices I've ever made.
I thought that chapter of my life was closed, and I'd finally get to live in peace. But here he is again, stirring up the past.
Let me explain. About 8 years ago, I was happily married to a man named Eric. At least, I thought I was happy. Back then, I believed our relationship was solid as a rock.
We had what I considered a strong bond. We dated for 2 years, spent almost a year engaged while we mapped out our wedding, and then tied the knot. I was all in. I would have fought tooth and nail to protect our marriage because I truly believed we were soulmates.
Turns out, that was just me living in my own little fantasy.
A few months after we got married, Eric lost his job. It was a tough time for both of us, no doubt, but I had faith we'd get through it together and that he'd find another opportunity. We had some savings to lean on, and I was working full-time, so I figured we'd manage. Things were tight for a while, but Eric seemed determined. He went to countless interviews, and finally, after what felt like forever, he landed a new job. I still remember how thrilled we were the day he got that offer. I wanted to celebrate, so I took him out to dinner. But little did I know, that job would end up shattering my marriage. After his first day at work, Eric came home looking completely drained. It wasn't the kind of tired you'd expect after starting a new job. He seemed deeply unsettled. I could tell the moment I saw him that something was off. When we sat down to talk, I got hit with news I never saw coming. In a twist that almost felt like a cruel joke, his ex-girlfriend, Carmen, worked at the same company.
Now, I already knew about Carmen.
Eric had dated her for 3 years before he met me, and he even proposed to her. She turned him down and broke things off, which, from what he told me, hit him hard. That was years before we got together, though. We didn't dwell on old relationships much, so aside from that one conversation early on, her name never came up again. But when he told me she was working at the same place, my stomach sank. Of all the people in the world, it had to be her.
I didn't know how to react.
Sure, it had been years, and Eric assured me he had no feelings for her anymore, but the thought of them working side by side didn't sit right with me. He seemed genuinely bothered by it too, and we spent hours talking about what to do. Eric even offered to quit, but with our savings dwindling, I wasn't sure how much longer I could cover all the bills without making some big sacrifices. Plus, I convinced myself that quitting over an ex was a bit childish. By the end of that long night, I felt a lot better. I told myself we were adults, and I trusted Eric completely. He reassured me over and over that he didn't care about Carmen and wouldn't interact with her unless it was absolutely necessary for work. That calmed me down, and as the days went by, I stopped thinking about her entirely. Eric was as loving and supportive as ever, and I was proud of how we handled what could have been a tricky situation.
Looking back now, I can't help but laugh at how naive I was.
I was so wrapped up in my love for him and the trust one had in our relationship that I didn't see the warning signs. A couple of months into his new job, Eric told me he had to go on a business trip. He mentioned that if it went well, it might lead to a promotion. Naturally, I was excited for him and suggested tagging along to make it a little getaway for the two of us. But he said he'd be too busy with work, and besides, the entire team going on the trip was made up of men, none of them were bringing their partners, so I'd feel out of place.
I was disappointed but didn't push back.
What he said made sense. When he got back, I asked about the meetings and whether he thought the promotion was still on the table. He told me it went well, but he'd have to attend a few more meetings before anything was finalized. Over the next 3 months, these trips became a regular thing, at least once a month, but there was no news of a promotion. Instead of raising an eyebrow, I was actually worried that his company was overworking him without giving him a raise.
During this whole time, Carmen didn't cross my mind.
After that first big talk, neither of us brought her up again. Even when she popped into my head briefly, I pushed the thought aside. When I eventually shared all this with my friends during the divorce, they said I was ridiculously naive for trusting him so blindly.
And yeah, I see that now.
But back then, I trusted Eric with everything, even my life. Then, 5 months into his new job, I realized I'd missed my period. At first, I didn't think much of it, but to put my mind at ease, I decided to take a pregnancy test. To my complete surprise, the pregnancy test came back positive. I wasn't expecting it at all. This wasn't a planned pregnancy, but with Eric's new job and our finances finally in a stable place, I started to think it might actually be a blessing in disguise. I was nervous about how he'd react, but I was also excited to share the news with him. Eric was away on yet another business trip the day I took the test, but he was due back later that evening. I decided to wait and tell him in person. I still remember how jittery I felt, imagining how our life would change and dreaming of the possibilities ahead of us. It was late when he finally got home, but I'd stayed up to have dinner together. The moment he walked through the door, I could see something was off. He looked upset. Naturally, I asked him what was wrong, but he brushed it off, saying it was just work stuff and that he didn't feel like talking about it. I thought I could cheer him up with the news. Trying to lighten the mood, I told him to wait a second while I grabbed the test kit. I came back, asked him to close his eyes, held the test up, and told him to open them. He just stared at me, and after a long pause, he asked, "Is that what I think it is?" I smiled, thinking he was just stunned, and told him, "Yes. We're going to be parents." I was so excited, waiting for him to share in the joy. But instead of smiling or saying anything comforting, he just sat there, looking completely blank. The silence dragged on, and I started feeling uneasy. I asked him if he was okay and whether he wasn't happy about the news. His face changed slightly, and he said he was just caught off guard by the surprise. I tried to reassure him, saying that I hadn't expected it either, but maybe this could be a wonderful thing for us. I told him we'd handle it together, no matter what. But he still seemed distant and uncomfortable. Then he said he needed time to process everything. That was not the reaction I expected. I thought he would be thrilled or at least supportive. His reaction crushed me. I told him I was disappointed in how he was acting. Instead of apologizing, he brushed me off, saying I couldn't expect him to be thrilled about such a life-changing event happening without his input. Those words stung. I snapped back, saying that when he married me, he signed up for this possibility, and if he couldn't handle being a good husband, maybe we needed to rethink our relationship. I said it out of anger and hurt, and I didn't mean it at the time. But his response shook me to my core. He said, "Maybe we do," and walked out of the room without another word. I was heartbroken. That night, I cried alone in the living room and ended up sleeping on the couch because I couldn't bear to face him in our bed. He didn't come out to check on me, not once. Even then, I clung to the hope that we'd get past this. I thought, somehow, we'd find a way to fix things. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of him moving around in the kitchen, already dressed for work and making breakfast. I stayed silent, went into our bedroom, and shut the door behind me. He didn't follow me, didn't say a single word. After a while, I heard the front door close as he left for work. That day, I was a wreck. I called in sick and spent hours crying, talking to my mom and my closest friends about what had happened. It's a day I remember vividly, like it happened yesterday. By the time he was supposed to come home, I'd rehearsed a whole speech. I was going to tell him exactly how much he'd hurt me and how he needed to step up as a husband. But what I didn't know was that he had a speech of his own, one that would completely blindside me. The moment he walked in, he said, "We need to talk." That worked for me because I had plenty to say too. But what he came out with wasn't anything I could have prepared for. We sat down across from each other, and without any lead-in, he looked me dead in the eye and asked, "Whose baby is it?" At first, I didn't even understand what he was asking. I stared at him, confused, and asked him to repeat himself. He did, saying the exact same thing, "Whose baby is it?" I felt like the ground had just dropped out from under me. I stammered, asking what he meant by that. Who else's baby could it possibly be? I told him, "It's obviously yours, what kind of question is that?" But he didn't let it go. He told me we were past the point of pretending and that I should just come clean. I was in total shock. My voice cracked as I told him again that it was his baby and I had no idea why he'd even think otherwise. He wouldn't look me in the eye and said something that shattered me completely. "That was back when you still cared about this relationship." By then, I was crying uncontrollably. I kept telling him that I loved him, that I'd never been anything but loyal to him, and that our marriage meant everything to me. But he just kept repeating the question, "Whose baby is it?" over and over, like he was trying to break me down. He said he wasn't going to raise another man's child or live with a lie. I was sobbing, begging him to believe me, but nothing I said seemed to matter. Then he said something that made my head spin. "The way you can't wait for me to leave on business trips says everything I need to know about your loyalty." I was too stunned to even respond. Every time he went on a trip, I felt sad but told myself to support him because I knew how much he'd struggled to get this job. Every single time, I told myself to be the bigger person and trust him. But now, it was like none of that mattered. When Eric started traveling for work, I stopped calling him more than once a day because he rarely answered. He'd usually text me, saying he was busy with clients. I thought I was being considerate, putting his needs first, but to hear him twist that into some kind of proof that I wanted him gone? That I was sneaking around with someone else? It felt like a slap across the face. I remember sitting there, sick to my stomach, hoping I was trapped in some kind of bad dream. I told him everything, how I tried to be a supportive wife, how I stayed faithful, how I thought we were building a life together. But he wasn't interested in listening. He told me to stop wasting time making him the villain because he was tired of feeling unwanted and wouldn't let me make a fool of him. He accused me of being distant ever since he started his new job. He said I didn't make him feel appreciated, that I looked happier when he wasn't home, and that I acted like I didn't even care when he returned. I tried to explain that he was wrong, that this was all just a huge misunderstanding, but he wouldn't hear it. He kept insisting there was someone else in my life, someone I apparently preferred over him. I was desperate. I asked him if he had any proof of the things he was accusing me of, and his response? "I don't need proof to see what's obvious to anyone with half a brain cell." That shut me up for a moment. What could I even say to that? Through my tears, I kept repeating that I hadn't been with anyone else, that I spent most of my time either at home or occasionally out with friends. I even offered to let him go through my phone, thinking maybe that would ease his paranoia. But he scoffed at the idea, saying I'd probably deleted any evidence. That's when I felt truly defeated. I had no more words left. I asked him what he wanted me to do to prove my loyalty. Out of sheer desperation, I even offered to do a paternity test after the baby was born. Saying those words felt like ripping away every last shred of my dignity. Never in my life had I imagined needing to do something so degrading to prove my worth to someone who was supposed to trust me. But even that wasn't enough for him. He said he couldn't wait 9 months for confirmation of what he saw as a betrayal. He told me flat out that he wasn't going to help me raise a child that wasn't his. I snapped. I screamed at him, calling him a delusional freak for not believing me. That's when he dropped the bombshell that shook me to my core. He told me that if I wanted to stay married to him, I needed to get an abortion. An abortion. I was horrified. I asked him to stop for a moment and think about the words coming out of his mouth. I begged him to see how irrational and cruel he was being. But he stood his ground. I asked him what he'd do if I refused, and he didn't even hesitate. He told me, "If you don't get an abortion, it's divorce." Hearing him say that word, divorce, hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe it. I asked him if he was serious, and he looked me straight in the eye and said yes. At that moment, something inside me shifted. The sadness, the hurt, it all disappeared, replaced by a calm anger I didn't know I was capable of. I told him he could do whatever he wanted, but I was keeping my baby, with or without him. He stared at me coldly and said, "I hope you didn't sleep with a deadbeat," before walking out of the house. That was the last time we were under the same roof as husband and wife. Later that day, he texted me, saying he'd come back to get his things. I gave him a time when I'd be out and told him to make sure he was gone before I returned. The very next day, I met with a lawyer to start the divorce process. We had bought that house together. It was our first home, and selling it felt like erasing everything we'd built. But Eric and I both wanted things to be quick and drama-free. We sold the house and split the money evenly. As for the rest of our things, we took whatever we wanted and moved on. I stayed with my sister while I figured out my next steps, and Eric, Well, I didn't care where he went. We cut contact completely. Nobody, neither our family nor our friends, saw this coming. I lost count of how many times I broke down trying to explain what had happened to people who thought we were the perfect couple. Eric never budged. He refused to hear me out, refused to believe anything but the story he'd made up in his head. When my son was born, I texted him to let him know. I thought maybe seeing his child would bring him back to his senses. But he didn't respond. Not a word. Months later, one of the wives of his co-workers reached out to me. She asked if I'd heard about Eric, and when I said no, she hesitated before saying she thought I should know. That's when I found out he'd been seeing Carmen all along. Carmen, the woman from his office, was apparently the talk of the company. The two of them had been together for months, sneaking around while I was at home trying to keep our life together. Those so-called business trips were nothing but excuses to spend time at her place. And it gets worse. Carmen had been feeding him the idea that I must have been cheating on him. She told him that if she had a husband, she'd never let him be away so much, and that any woman who didn't feel the same must be up to something. When I learned all this, I felt like the dumbest person alive. The red flags were there, but I'd missed every single one. Or maybe I'd chosen not to see them. The months that followed were the darkest of my life. I fell into a deep depression. I quit my job because I couldn't function. I had to rely on my family to get by, which only added to my guilt and feelings of failure. Being a single mom, dealing with my depression, and feeling like a burden on my loved ones, it was unbearable. But my sister, she saved me. She stood by me when I couldn't stand on my own. Slowly, I started to heal. I stopped obsessing over Eric and Carmen. I focused on my son, found a new job, and eventually got a place of my own. 2 years ago, I married the most incredible man. He treats me like a queen and loves my son as his own. I never thought I'd find happiness again, but I did. Now that I've told you all of that, here's why I'm actually writing this post. A few weeks ago, I was mindlessly scrolling through Facebook when I got a message from Eric. Seeing his name pop up after all these years felt like getting sucker punched. My stomach dropped, my hands froze, and for a moment, I just stared at it. Part of me wanted to ignore it entirely, but curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked. The message was long, way longer than I expected, and full of things I never thought I'd hear from him. He started by saying he'd been trying to contact me for a while but couldn't because my number had changed, and he didn't know where I lived anymore. Then came the bombshell: he and Carmen had broken up. Apparently, she'd been cheating on him with multiple men, and he was only now realizing how much damage she'd done, not just to him but to us. He admitted that letting her come between us was the biggest mistake of his life. He said he thought about me and our son constantly over the past 8 years but felt too ashamed to reach out. He said he understood I'd never forgive him, but he wanted to be in his son's life and would do anything for the chance to prove he could be a good dad. I sat there for a long time after reading it, just letting it all sink in. The poetic justice of Carmen cheating on him after everything he accused me of? I can't lie, it gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. Seeing him grovel after years of silence? That part felt good too. But no amount of apologies or regret could undo the hurt he caused or erase the fact that he abandoned us when I needed him most. I thought about how to respond. Ignoring him was an option. Blocking him outright was another. But the longer I sat with it, the more the petty part of me started whispering ideas. And this time, I didn't silence it. Here's the thing: when my son was born, I chose not to put Eric's name on the birth certificate. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. He didn't deserve the honor of being listed as his father. Legally, Eric has no rights over him, and morally, he lost any claim the moment he walked away and refused to believe in my loyalty or his own child. Fast forward to now, I've been married to an amazing man for 2 years. He's everything Eric wasn't: kind, loving, supportive, and he's been in my son's life since he was little, treating him like his own from day one. Last year, on our wedding anniversary, he officially adopted my son. We're a family in every sense of the word. So, I decided to let the revengeful part of me take the reins. I responded to Eric, saying I didn't know what he was talking about. I told him my son was never his to begin with, and my wonderful husband had adopted him. I told him Carmen was right all along, he was exactly the type of man to get cheated on, and I was glad he was alone now because he deserved it. Then, as the cherry on top, I attached a picture of me, my husband, and our boy, all smiles, radiating happiness. And then I blocked him. Now, let me be clear, what I said about my son not being his biological child wasn't true. But that doesn't change the fact that Eric has no right to call himself my son's father. He forfeited that right long before my son was even born. And honestly, I couldn't resist the opportunity to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he caused me. When I told my husband what I'd done, he laughed and said I didn't have to go that far. But he didn't seem upset about it, so I let it go. Last night, I reached out to Melanie, her husband works in the same industry as Eric, and casually asked if she'd heard anything about him. Turns out, she was about to message me about the same thing. She told me Eric hasn't been doing well. He's been showing up to work drunk and nearly got fired. Melanie doesn't know about the message I sent him, so she figured his downward spiral was just him processing his breakup with Carmen. I just listened, pretending to be surprised, and thanked her for letting me know. But I can't lie, it made me feel a little guilty. Did I take things too far? Update 1. Hey, everyone. I wanted to say thank you for all the support and advice. It's been comforting to read your comments and see so many people agreeing that Eric got what he deserved. It's validating in a way I didn't expect. I do have a bit of an update. Melanie reached out again with more news about Eric. Apparently, a few months back, he and Carmen had a massive fight at the office. It got ugly, shouting, pushing, the works, and several co-workers witnessed it. Both of them were fired shortly after, and no one's heard from either of them since. I can't say I feel sorry for him. If anything, I'm relieved he's channeling his anger toward Carmen and not trying to drag me back into his mess. The last thing I want is to deal with him ever again. After Melanie told me this, I decided to be honest with her about what I'd said to Eric. She listened but seemed a little concerned. She hates Eric for what he did to me and my son, but she gently pointed out that I might have gone too far. She said it's not worth letting past pain consume him or me this much. And maybe she's right. But at the same time, I can't help but feel like I finally stood up for myself, in my own way. Melanie keeps telling me I should reach out to Eric again and tell him the truth. She's promised not to breathe a word of this to anyone, but she genuinely believes it's the right thing to do. I don't agree. Not even a little. For one, I don't care about Eric enough to ease his misery. He's not my problem. But more importantly, I don't trust him. Even though the chances are slim, there's always a risk that he could channel his anger into trying to force his way into my son's life. That's a risk I'm not willing to take. My son is too important to me to let someone as unreliable and self-serving as Eric anywhere near him. Besides, Eric only has himself to blame for his situation. I didn't lie to him when we were married, I didn't wrong him back then, and I haven't wronged him now. All I did was hold a mirror up to his actions, and if the reflection isn't pretty, that's on him. So why this is such a devastating blow to him now, after everything, is beyond me. Update 2. Since my last update, I've done a lot of thinking. Eventually, I decided to sit down and have an honest conversation with my husband about everything: Eric's message, my response, and Melanie's suggestion. As always, my husband was understanding and supportive. He listened patiently while I explained every detail, never once interrupting. The whole time, he held my hand, reassuring me with his quiet presence. When I finally finished, he told me he understood why I responded to Eric the way I did, but he gently pointed out that it might have been a bit harsh. We ended up talking about the importance of not letting the past have power over our present happiness. That conversation shifted something in me. It helped me see things more clearly. While I don't regret standing up for myself and protecting my son, I realize now that holding on to resentment isn't doing me any favors. Eric made his choices, and he's living with the consequences. But I don't have to let my feelings about him linger in the corners of my life. My husband suggested that working through these feelings might help me move forward. He wasn't pushy about it, just calm and thoughtful, and I couldn't help but agree with him. I want to be the best version of myself for him, for my son, and for me. Update 3. Hi again. I wanted to share a quick update on where I'm at now. After my conversation with my husband, I decided to reach out to a therapist to help me process everything. It's been eye-opening, to say the least. Working with a professional has helped me see that letting go of the past isn't about forgiving Eric or excusing what he did. It's about freeing myself from the weight of that resentment so I can be a better wife and mom. This journey isn't about Eric, it's about me, my marriage, and my family. Some of you had asked if I'd ever tried therapy before, and honestly, you were right, it's exactly what I needed. It feels good to take these steps, knowing I'm investing in my own happiness and emotional well-being. As for Eric? I haven't heard anything more from Melanie, and I haven't asked. I don't care how he's doing. He's a grown man, and his issues are his own. I've got a good life, a happy family, and no room for his chaos. Looking back, I'm glad he reached out to me. It forced me to stand up for myself in a way I hadn't before, and in the end, he got exactly what he deserved. But now? Now it's time to let him and all of that go, for good.